A single box plot really doesn't offer much advantage over a histogram and loses a lot of the detail, but the real strength in box plots is for side-by-side comparisons. What we have here is a box plot taken from StatKey, which has side-by-side comparisons of this variable physical activity, which is the percentage of residents who do at least 150 minutes of physical aerobic activity per week, and it is broken apart by region. So the percentage of residents within each state. This is from the U.S. states data set, and each case in this data set is a state. And so we could think of this physical activity as maybe starting out as a quantitative variable, number of minutes of aerobic physical activity per week. Then it becomes categorical when we change it into yes or no, is it more than 150? And then it becomes quantitative again when we aggregate over the state and turn it into a percent for that whole state, a percent of residents who do at least that amount of physical activity. So kind of a funny variable to track through all of the ways in which it could have been measured. In this graph, we can see that the box plots are oriented horizontally now. It's nice when they're oriented horizontally because if we need to describe the direction of the skew, it's already laid out as left and right. But both orientations are very common. This is the orientation that StatKey does. So looking at this, we can see that the explanatory variable here is region. We're interested in the physical activity by region. So we're assuming the region would predict the physical activity rather than the other way around. So explanatory variable is region, where region is south, west, northeast, or midwest, so it is categorical. And the response variable is that physical activity variable that we were just talking about, which is quantitative. So side-by-side box plot is the kind of graph that you would get or that you would want to look at if you have one categorical variable and one quantitative variable. The quantitative variable is the one that each box represents. In order to compare these, they have to all represent the same variable. It wouldn't make sense to compare shoe size to height, right? These are different variables measured in different units, but it does make sense to compare physical activity in the South to physical activity in the West. So it's only one quantitative variable that each of these boxes represents, and then the categorical variable is the one that defines the groups. So this defines the groups for the side-by-side comparison. And the quantitative variable is what each box is illustrating. Now we can see the highest activity levels, on average, seem to be in the West. We have a high outlier, and also the whole distribution seems to sit to the right of the other distributions. So highest activity levels are seen in the West. Lowest activity levels, well, that would be in the South. That's us here in Texas. So lowest activity levels are seen in the South. And I would say that this difference is pretty dramatic. So when we get into the question of whether this difference appears likely to be due to chance, that could either be a very small difference, or it could be maybe a very small sample size. In this case, we have 50 states, and each state is a case. It's not a huge sample for 4 groups, but the difference is pretty dramatic here. So I would say this looks unlikely to be due to chance. So we will answer no to this because the differences are pretty big. Due to chance just means if I were to take any groupings of people in this country and measure their physical activity, I wouldn't expect them to come out exactly the same no matter what. Even if the groups that I decided to define were completely meaningless at predicting physical activity, the distribution still wouldn't look identical just because by luck you're generally going to get a little bit of variation. So if you have the kind of variation that looks like it could have been just luck, then we would say, yes, it really does seem like it's possible that that was just due to chance. Here we think there are definitely regional differences. The spread of physical activity in these regions. We see the smallest spread, especially if we ignore the outlier here, we see the smallest spread in the West. This is more concentrated at the center. So everybody tends to get more activity. There's not a whole lot of variation in that either. We also see the largest spread in the South. It's not always the case that the two most extreme values are also the most extreme in spread. But what we're looking for here is how big is the box, right? How wide is that? And how far out do the whiskers go, right? This one is the widest overall, and this one for the West is the smallest overall. Smaller box, smaller spread out to the whiskers. For Midwest and Northeast, these are both in between for spread and for values. So we would say the largest amount of variability. Spread and variability are the same thing, so let's use both words just to get used to them. Largest variability in the South. Smallest in the West. Now note that even though we said the differences are big and they're not likely to be due to chance, that doesn't mean we can say that living in a certain region causes people to exercise more or less. Certainly it's true that in the West the weather is very conducive to being outdoors. It's dry, we don't get that humidity, we don't get as much rainfall, really nice cool evenings, so you can always find a good time of day to get out for a run or something like that. Whereas in the South, we tend to see more of the warm, hot, humid summers. It's a little bit more difficult to get outside and be active, so that may be a contributing factor. But it also could be that people who are real exercise enthusiasts to start with are drawn towards that weather that will get them to, or that will allow them to work out a bit more. So it could be that people who want to work out anyway move to the West Coast, and that we see some of that factoring in as well. So we don't know that there's a causal relationship here. All we can say is that it does look like physical activity varies by region, more than what we would attribute to chance.